Hi everyone! This video is about cilia and flagella. Cilia and flagella are structures found on the outsides of cells. So if you look at these diagrams over here, we've got cilia around the outside of this cell and a flagellum sticking off the outside of this cell. For both cilia and flagella, their function is movement. And they share the same basic structure, which is a ring of microtubules wrapped in membrane. So in this diagram here, you can see those greenish things are the microtubules, and there's a ring of them. They're arranged in a ring like this, and the whole thing is wrapped in a layer of membrane. So this beige layer here shows that membrane. And you can see in the diagram that those microtubules are arranged in pairs as you go around in the ring here. And the way that the movement occurs is that the pairs of microtubules slide back and forth next to each other, and that ends up creating movement. At the bottom of the whole structure, inside the cell, kind of anchoring it inside, is something known as the basal body. You don't need to know that, but it is also made of microtubules. Cilia and flagella are found on many protists and some animal cells, as well as the sperm cells of animals and some types of plants. But in general, we're going to assume that plants do not have cilia or flagella. So let's take a closer look at each one. We'll start with cilia. So cilia are numerous short hair-like structures on the outside of a cell. Here in this diagram, you can see all those little fuzzy structures around the edges. And here in a picture of an actual cell, this is a protist called paramecium, you can just barely see all these tiny little hair-like structures around the edges of the cell that are making it look a little bit fuzzy. The way that cilia work is by waving back and forth, kind of like this. So if you imagine all these hundreds or even thousands of tiny little hair-like structures all waving back and forth on the outside of a cell, it's almost like rowers on a boat. So if you imagine all of these individual rowers, each with their oar, and they're all rowing at the same time, they're going to move that boat pretty quickly wherever it needs to go. Another example of cilia can be found in your own body on the cells that are lining your respiratory tract. So if we could zoom in on your windpipe and take a close look at the cells in there, each of these pink blobs is a cell, and those cells all have some cilia on the inside lining your windpipe. Under a scanning electron microscope, they'd look kind of like this, all these tiny little hair-like structures. And these cells lining your respiratory tract secrete a thin layer of mucus. I've shown it here in blue. And every time you inhale, you bring in not only the air, but also all the stuff that's in it. So dust and pollen and bacteria and viruses, all sorts of stuff. And what happens is those all get stuck in this thin layer of mucus on your cells. So maybe something like that, all these little dots showing those things getting stuck. Now, if that were to just stay there, it would get clogged really fast and you'd end up with all sorts of junk in your respiratory tract. But we don't want that. So what these cilia do is they're constantly moving, they're constantly sweeping this mucus upwards to get rid of that stuff that's stuck in it. And then as that mucus gets swept away, the cells will make new fresh mucus so that you can breathe clearly again and continue to be protected from all these things that are coming in from the air. So let's take a closer look now at flagella. So here is a cell with a flagellum on it, and flagella are one or a few longer whip-like structures. And the word flagellum actually comes from the Latin word for whip. So they're on the outside of the cell. They look almost like a tail or several tails, depending on how many flagella there are. Here's another example. This is a photosynthetic protist. You can see some of its little green chloroplasts there, and it has a single flagellum down on this end. It's a little bit difficult to see because it's not quite in focus, but there it is. The classic example of a cell with a flagellum, of course, is a sperm cell. So here it is with that long single flagellum. But there are cells that have multiple flagella. So here's a different kind of protist that has several flagella all sticking off it. The way that flagella work is by whipping back and forth, and because they're so long, this ends up creating a propeller-like motion. So here's a flagellum anchored in the cell, and it's this very long fiber, and because it's being whipped back and forth, it ends up creating a propeller-like motion by the end of it. So you may have noticed that in all the cells in these examples, there have been eukaryotic cells. Well, what about the prokaryotes? Well, it turns out that prokaryotes can have flagella, but they never have true cilia, and there's a couple things to watch out for. So you may remember that prokaryotic cells can have some fuzzy structures around the outside, but they are not cilia. Here's a eukaryotic cell with lots of short hair-like structures around the outside, so those would be cilia, and those would be used for movement. But a prokaryotic cell that has little fuzzy structures around the outside has pili instead, and if you remember, those are used for attaching to surfaces. So they're made of something slightly different and they have a different function for the cell. How about flagella? Well, here's that eukaryotic cell with a flagellum again, and here's a prokaryotic cell. You can see it also has some flagella, and this one also happens to have some pili. They are used for the same thing. They're used for motion in both the eukaryote and the prokaryote, but they're not quite the same. They have slightly different structures and they move in slightly different ways as well. If you take a look at this diagram down here, the prokaryotic flagellum works by spinning around. So it spins around on a rotor and creates motion that way, whereas the eukaryotic flagellum whips back and forth and creates motion in a slightly different way. And they're also made of slightly different molecules. This prokaryotic flagellum, you can see it's made of these little blue proteins here. They're known as flagellin. And the eukaryotic one you've already learned is made of these long microtubule fibers. So that's everything you need to know about cilia and flagella. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of each other.